Well, first off, thanks so much for inviting me to do this talk. And I guess I should introduce it by saying, one, I'm giving a talk on some of the research I've been doing over the last few years. And I've decided to do the talk a little bit in the spirit of, maybe two heads are better than one. I'm trying to figure some stuff out. So and I'll explain what in a minute. And so the hope is to give some time at the end for some dialogue about this, and maybe you'll have some perspectives on or ideas about this. So, the title of the talk is Mexico Naturally Rich or Poor? It's a matter of perspective. It has to do with this project I'm doing that examines discussions of Mexico's natural riches from the early 19th century until the mid-20th century. And while there have been disagreements about how rich Mexico was at a given moment, there tend to be sort of patterns. So the 19th century, we tend to see this idea that Mexico was extremely rich from a natural resource perspective. And then at the end of the 19th century, up through the mid-20th century or so, we see this representation of Mexico as naturally poor. And after the 1950s or so, the discussion kind of dies down. But it's worth noting that it is a big topic of discussion and debate. So the focus that the problem that I'm working on today is, how do we explain the shift from this idea that Mexico is naturally rich to this idea that Mexico is naturally poor? I mean, the naturally rich one isn't as difficult to explain because you can see its antecedents in the chronicles of the conquistadores like Cortez and Bernal Diaz, et cetera, et cetera. It gets reformulated but continues into the national period. The one that I'm sort of struggling a little more with is the shift from one representation to another. What counts for it? What I'm going to be talking mostly about is one particular book. It's in this text here, Obras Completas de Justo Sierra. It's his 1889 essay, México Social y Político, Mexico Social and Political. And my argument is that this particular essay that he wrote in 1889 has a lot to do with this new interpretation, and also of Mexico being naturally poor, that is. And we can see that others, after he wrote this new narrative, repeated it and reformulated it, and so it sort of takes on a life of its own and is the springboard of this new way of understanding Mexico's natural wealth. A couple words about Sierra. He was, in the late 19th century Mexico, one of the leading intellectuals, one of the group known as the científicos, or scientists, because of their great belief in science and positivism. He was influential in shaping the ideology of the government of Porfirio Diaz. Diaz ruled Mexico from 1876 to 1910. And Sierra was a leading member of the Científicos, a leading ideologue, the Minister of Education, so a very influential intellectual during this period. The way that, and as way of thesis, this is the thing I wanted help on, but what I'm exploring and working with is this idea that it's not so much new measurements that Justo Sierra is engaged in his reassessment. It's more related to a new perspective. He's taking on just a new perspective on things. That seems to help explain the shift in assessments. And also, it seems to be quite linked to his concerns about Mexican national identity. The way I'm going to do this talk is, first I'm going to talk about the text, And then I'm going to turn to the issue of explanations for the shifting dialogue or assessment or narrative, right, about Mexico's natural riches. Well, if we look real briefly at the context of the period, this is written in 1889. And from Mexican history, I suppose this is a pretty good period. I mean, Mexico became independent in 1821, and in the first half century or so of independence, faced a lot of problems. One was foreign interventions, right? That we had several. The most significant was the Mexican-American War, in which Mexico lost half its territory. We also have the French intervention in the 1860s with 30,000 troops, where French occupied Mexico for a few years. So by the time Sierra's writing in 89, diplomatic relations have been improved with foreign countries. Mexico is sovereign, but there is concerns about those issues. From a political front, and kind of feeding into some of these foreign interventions, there was huge divisions in Mexico between liberals and conservatives, and it caused a lot of internal political chaos where there was a quick changes in leadership through political coups. The conservatives actually sort of invited the French in to help on their side in this fight. With the liberals, they were discredited after that in the late 1860s, and a consequence of that would be that we have the liberals triumphant. And so it's sort of relative political stability. We have conservatism discredited. Porfirio Diaz becomes president in 1876. By this, in 1880, he steps down. Someone else replaces him, but he's come back to power after that. So it's before Diaz is going to keep remaining in power, but we don't know that yet. And then from an economic standpoint, there was these great predictions that Mexico would be maybe the most valuable area of the Western Hemisphere. The turmoils of early 19th century made that clear that probably wasn't the case. However, and there was a lot of economic stagnation, essentially. Mexico had its historic wealth in mining, the biggest silver producer in the world. What we see during the late 19th century, it's known in Latin America as the age of the export boom, and we see a kind of a jump start of the economy. And Mexico began to get integrated more into the global economy. High levels of foreign investment, the beginning of the building of the railroads, creation of national industry. It's worth noting, though, that sometimes scholars split up this period, and the split is 1890. I don't know if it's a little arbitrary, but the idea is that while the economic sort of boom, if you want to call it that, or sort of impulse started in the 1880s, it's really from 1890 to 1910, or 1907 actually, to be more precise, that it speeds up even more. So Sierra's writing when things have improved economically, but not as much as they will. So what about the Justo Sierra's approach? Well, when he talks about theory, and the theory he's going to use to analyze Mexico's social, economic, and political conditions. And by the way, the text first has a section on demography, then economy, and then politics. I'm focusing more on the section on economy because that is more relevant to what we're talking about here. And he says that, he's a positivist, follower of Comte's positivism, the French theorist. He also talks about liking to utilize induction and empirical approach. And this is in contrast to what he kind of sees as what's been done before, the rise of Romanticism, right? And also, previous to him, the other issue would be sort of abstract theory, deduction, like this idea that a certain theory will explain phenomenon. And he thinks that you need to take a closer look at things He's probably partially influenced also by the German Historical School of Economics in that more historical, empirical approach. So that's what he says he's going to do. And so what are the claims? What are the main points that he makes in this book or in this essay? Well, one of the claims is that, and this comes out repeatedly, the ancestors have been wrong. The notion that Mexico was naturally rich is false. And we've believed this, and we've overestimated things here. And it goes back to writers like Alexander von Humboldt in the early 19th century, who wrote the political essay on the Kingdom of New Spain, who glorified Mexico's natural wealth. And so Sierra says, you guys got it wrong. And he says that, why? He doesn't exactly explain why, but he sort of says it's probably patriotism. This idea that, it's patriotic to represent your country as naturally rich. And another point that he makes is that this hasn't been good for us. An overestimation, an exaggeration hasn't done good for, it's been bad for us. I mean, he talks about humiliations, bitterness. I mean, I guess humiliation in the sense that, all this talk and nothing to show for it. And, this doesn't, so this is a main point that he makes. And what he's going to do is going to say that, we should be satisfied with a lot less. That's sort of his thesis, that we're not where you thought we were, but we're not that. It's not horrible, but we need to, let's face it, people, let's be realists here. He's almost like a patriotic call for a reassessment that will allow Mexico to move forward in a way where expectations are akin with reality. The part of the, a couple parts about organization. One, he says he's going to follow the political economists, which I don't know if he really does too much, but he divides up his study into natural resources, labor, and capital. That's what he divides, although he's kind of imprecise in what he covers under each one. And part of his rhetorical strategy is to say that he says that Mexican natural conditions are an irony of the creator. Like, on the one hand, you've got he's kind of going over the narrative that he's sort of trying to dispute. You have a large country in terms of geographical terms. You have varied climates. You have tropical, semi-tropical, and temperate. You have two coasts, right, that you border the Atlantic and the Pacific. And there were lots of discussions about that a canal would be filled through there, which it was a little further south, right, the Panama Canal, just a little later. And the idea with the varied altitudes and climates, you could grow almost anything in the world. And of course, the silver wealth. I mean, this goes back to the colonial period, and it's when Mexico was, along with Bolivia, were the leading silver producers in the world. And I mean, one of the reasons that France invaded in the 1860s in the first place was to get that silver. So I mean, this is sort of this irony, this that it looks rich, but then he goes on to say that it isn't. And it seems to me that his counter-narrative focuses on two things. One, it focuses on it focuses on Mexico's natural conditions. What are they? The other it focuses a lot on his population. And the part of the population discussion is related to natural conditions. How many people this is the age of colonization, right? Population increase, how many people can Mexico sustain? The other part is sort of linked to a social discourse about, along with economic issues, there are social issues that prevent Mexico's progress. The So let me just briefly go over some parts of the critique. One is about, he divides it up in, one part is the coasts. He talks about the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts, and he points out that the Atlantic coast, well, there aren't any good ports. And on the Pacific coast, well, there might be better ports, but there aren't any people. So, I mean, this benefit of bordering these two great oceans, it's limited by nature. The agricultural wealth, he talks a lot about agriculture, and Humboldt had talked about the fact that Mexico had more fertile land than any country in the world, and he kind of compared it to France and other countries, et cetera. And all Sierra does is complain about it. He says that the soil's infertile. He says that, the big issue, rain. There isn't any rain. So we have to, or irrigation. And that really, this idea of agricultural riches, we don't have them. Our natural conditions are really antithetical to agricultural riches and production. Yeah?
Was Humboldt writing before the Mexican War? Mexican-American War?
Yeah, he wrote in, he was invited over by Spain just in the era as independence was about to be won. He was in the Americas from 1799 to 1804. He was in Mexico basically for 1 year, 1804, late 1803 to late 1804. The stuff he wrote came out originally in 1811, and then it was translated into a lot of different languages. So that's sort of the timeline for that. So it is quite a bit earlier. And if we turn to silver, one of the big issues with silver was that he calls it, the minerals of Mexico, I guess, of third order, like this inferior minerals. And so what's the deal? They still have a lot of silver. Well, the problem, according to Sierra, is that what's happened since the 1870s is the value of silver internationally was declining. So vis-a-vis gold. So silver was worth less. And he also says it's really hard to exploit it. I mean, you have poor transport. You don't have the energy resources to get at the silver. The colonial era, most of it was extracted, and the stuff that's left over is hard to get at. It's just too expensive given all these natural obstacles and the falling international price. He talked about industry, and I guess he doesn't critique industry as much in the sense that, manufacturing industry, that he says that it doesn't have such a history in this sort of vision of it being the leading aspect of the Mexican economy. But nevertheless, he does complain about the problem of fossil fuels, the lack of coal. In the Second Industrial Revolution, coal is key to manufacturing industries, and Mexico doesn't have that. A big issue he talks about is transportation and geography. The point being that Mexico doesn't have any navigable rivers. It's very mountainous. Therefore, it's just hard not only for internal trade, but also to export things, because there might be something valuable, but you can't get at it because of Mexico's difficult terrain. Part of this critique that he takes on is comparative, in the sense that he talks about other countries that are a lot better, right? He talks about, in terms of agriculture, California. He talks about Russia. He goes on about the Mississippi and how the Mississippi for the U.S. is sort of this key waterway that industry and commerce get sort of connected through. Great Britain, the biggest coal producer in the world and the leader in the Industrial Revolution in manufacturing. Poor Mexico, we don't have any of this stuff. So that's part of. If we turn to the physical environment and issues related to the physical environment, related to the population, this is kind of basically, you have to remember, maybe I should emphasize, what he's doing here, particularly in the issue of agriculture and mining, is he's trying to explode this idea of these riches. He's a counter-narrative. The same has to do with the population. Since actually before Mexico became independent, there was this idea of colonization. In Humboldt's writing, it was this idea that Mexico was naturally rich, but too few people. So it was a huge 19th century colonization discourse, and that we're going to inhabit this place, and the only problem we have is that we don't have the people to work the land. And in fact, the natives would work the land, but they're so lazy, they're just hanging out eating bananas and not doing anything. I mean, everything's falling from the trees, and that's really the impression you get. And part of the argument was that Mexico didn't produce much because it was so rich that people didn't need to work to get by and enjoy life. And so what he says is that this is by the late 19th century. Mexico hasn't had much colonization, even though it has tried to even have official colonization to bring Europeans in. He says, forget it. He goes, this place is uninhabitable. He says that, we have the problems of yellow fever in the tropics. We have the high altitudes, and, people can't breathe, they can't work, they're weak because of lack of oxygen. And he says that, this place, the idea that this place could be teeming with people is a pipe dream. We can't do that. He goes, maybe blacks could deal with the environmental conditions, but for social reasons, we don't want to bring them in. So he really attacks that idea that Mexico is naturally rich but short in people. Other population issues he talks about, one has to do with is repression. It's like, workers aren't treated well. It's true we don't have slavery, but there's a kind of a culture of repression. And he talks about, in addition to that, workers not being treated well, he talks about concentration of wealth, and that isn't good for economic progress. He also talks about certain traits like, vices of drinking, and also the disdain for manual work that comes from the colonial period, and he wishes people were sort of less interested in administration and more interested in sort of getting their hands dirty, doing physical labor. So there's that sort of work ethic is another piece of all that. There is a little bit of a nationalist element too. It's not too strong, but one of the reasons that Asia isn't seen as the greatest in terms of that Pacific connection is because, well, the Asians are going to industrialize and they're going to send cheap goods over here, and our own industries are going to be outcompeted. And he's also a little concerned that if you take the industries like the manufacturing and the railroads, I don't know why he doesn't mention the mining, because they too are foreign controlled, and there may be something about, he doesn't go too much into it, but it seems to be a little, he notices that foreigners are in control of some aspects of the economy. So what's the lesson of all this for Justo Sierra? Well, the lesson of his discussion is sort of what I mentioned in the beginning, and that lesson is that we need to lower our expectations. And he's sort of like, he's kind of realistic here. He's like, we can get some railroads. It's tough because it's so mountainous and we don't have the industrial resources, but we do have some capital trickling in, and that should be enough to build a few more. It's not like we should get all depressed about this and we're going to be okay, but that's about it. So his real idea is that we shouldn't expect so much because our natural conditions don't permit it. Part of the lesson too is that there's no free lunch. I mean, well, maybe there is, right? I don't know. Okay, so but the issue being that you have to work. like, things are tough here. You know, nature isn't giving us anything for free. So for us as Mexicans to move forward, we got to put, you know, our nose to the grindstone. That's sort of the message he's giving. That, you know, it's almost like a pep talk. Let's go, people. Let's work. Let's make this happen. And also part of it is he does believe in the role of the state. He thinks that he kind of critiques laissez-faire, and he says that, you know, the state can play a role in promoting national industry. It can play a role in subsidizing railroad development. And even though it's going to, you know, the success may be sort of limited, but nevertheless, it's worthwhile effort because it will help deal with our geographical obstacles to commerce. And colonization. He goes, you know, I realize we don't have that vision that we thought we had, but, you know, we can get a few people to come, and that'll help. They can colonize some rural areas. When we develop the infrastructure, there'll be some appeal for them. So that's sort of his lesson. And what about his legacy? What's his legacy? That's the last thing I wanted to go into, and before, how do we explain what he did? The legacy, it seems to me, and part of what my argument is that this shift in discussion and representation of Mexico is linked to the fact that Sierra, he kind of gets a new narrative going, and other people repeat it. So when we see later articulations of this, and I should mention there's one in 1900. When the subtitle of this essay I'm talking about is Points for a Book. And between 1900 and 1902, he published a 3-volume thing, Mexico, Its Social Evolution. He was the editor of it. He wrote one section, but it had a bunch of authors in it. And what we see in that book, and some later writings, is a rearticulation of what Sierra had said. And aspects of it that get repeated, ancestors adhered to a legend of wealth, and adhering to the false legend had these terrible consequences. And actually, this part is filled out a lot because, you know, people talk about the fact that it made Mexicans lazy, and therefore they didn't work, and therefore the economy got behind. There also was the idea that foreigners were infected with this idea, and therefore they invaded Mexico. So this legend becomes part of a narrative of explaining Mexico's 19th century woes, a little bit more filled in, but along the lines of what Sierra was suggesting in 1889. Also part of it is that there's utilization of irony. People talk about, you know, Mexico's, the shape of it, a horn of abundance, you know, but it's all ironical, right? The fact is there's nothing there. And we also have the repetition of aspects of Sierra's narrative of Mexico being naturally poor. You know, the problem with transportation, the problem with the ports, the lack of fossil fuels. I mean, you just go down the list and you see this stuff over and over again. One of the lessons also is similar, which is got to work. The lesson of the day is hard work, right? Not easy. It's true that later we're going to see that this discussion is utilized in new ways, in the sense that, for instance, during the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920, there's a big call for economic nationalism, kick the foreigners out. There's also a call to redistribute the land. And some of these científicos like Sierra, who actually died in 1912, but others utilized this idea, the critique of the legend of wealth, to say, hey, redistribution of land won't help because, you know, the problem isn't that it's concentrated, it's the problem that there's nothing there. You know, and the idea that foreigners were ripping us off and therefore they should be expropriated. No, the problem is it costs a lot of money because you can't get blood out of a stone. So that whole kind of, sometimes, in some ways it was re-articulated, but we see that narrative continue. So I think I'm doing pretty good here on time because I want to leave a few minutes to talk. The last issue I want to discuss is, so how do we explain it? Like, I mean, how do we explain that the emergence of this new way of depicting Mexico. And this is sort of what I'm still scratching my head about. So I'll give you some of my reflections on that. Well, one of the things, it seems to me, is that if we're going to ask what type of an essay this is that Sierra wrote, I was reflecting, I was saying, it seems like it's largely about national identity, right? It's about this idea that the identity we've had has hindered us, and we need to recast that identity, sort of swallow our pride and come to love mediocrity, right? I mean, that's sort of what he seems to be saying. And so I think that that's interesting, that this is sort of, it's not like an economist trying to measure things. It's somebody trying to talk about Mexico's national identity from sort of this historical perspective. Also, despite the fact that Humboldt makes claims about empiricism and positivism, it's not really a measuring project. He's not really measuring stuff. He's bringing very little new information into the discussion. We already knew almost all this stuff. So that's kind of interesting, and that's why part of the title I have for the talk is Mexico naturally rich or poor? It's a matter of perspective. He seems to be offering a different perspective. And since he really isn't saying anything new, he's taking that old information and sort of reformulating it a little bit, right? That's what's happening. So what are some of these older discussions that he's utilizing? Well, one of the older discussions that he's utilizing is a social discourse. And this social discourse, you can actually even see it with Humboldt. Humboldt said, Mexico is a land of extreme inequality. And that inequality, he kind of talked about more from a social than an economic perspective. He talked about the Tupac Amaru rebellion in the 1780s in Peru, and that maybe Mexico would be a victim of the similar race war type thing because of a caste system. If you see through the 19th century in Mexico, some of the leading thinkers did begin sort of a sociological analysis, which talked about these sort of social dilemmas. And some of them said, well, yeah, Mexico's naturally rich, and that's wonderful, but how are we going to exploit it when the church owns all the wealth? Or when the haciendas are so large that the yeoman farmer can't emerge? So Sierra is building on this sociological kind of analysis. But he's also, but the thing he's adding to that's new, he says, don't only have sort of problems with our social structure, but also we're naturally poor. So it's sort of like a double whammy. And interestingly, part of his critique of the natural environment seems to come right out of Humboldt. And that might seem strange. But if you look at Humboldt's text, which is glowing about Mexico's natural riches, it doesn't forget about the problems. But the way Humboldt did it and utilized it was to say that, for instance, he talked about the arid north and the deserts and how in this area we can't really, nature prohibits us from developing agriculture. But then Humboldt says that, this is the exception that proves the rule. It's true there are some isolated physical challenges to material development, but it doesn't undermine the fact that Mexico is naturally rich. So he talked about other problems like the lack of navigable rivers, the irregular rainfall, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of these things seem to come out of Humboldt. And actually, what we see is 19th century writers don't forget, after Humboldt, about Mexico's natural obstacles. However, they never turn them into, like Sierra does, this narrative that, I guess you could call it the cup half empty or the cup half full, right? For them, it's for Sierra, the point is that these natural obstacles are what he calls attention to, and it turns into others would observe them, but it didn't undermine the assumption that Mexico is naturally rich. For Sierra, it does. So that's one thing. Another thing, though, that it seems to me that Sierra is drawing on is another discourse that's actually one that Humboldt had attempted to undermine. Since actually the age of Columbus and before, there had been this idea about the tropics, right? It goes back to Greece and Rome, et cetera. And the idea that the tropics were a place that was uninhabitable, where living was hard, and you couldn't especially populate the tropics. And actually, in the 18th century, European writers like Robertson and Dupas talked about the inferiority of the New World from this perspective. And actually, you get someone like Jefferson. And Jefferson, in a sense, he was similar to Humboldt. And part of his project was to say, hey, the New World isn't inferior. And it can, we have a lot of great things. And from Humboldt's perspective, obviously, he says at one point, this place could easily have tenfold the population, produce for national consumption, and produce for being a leader exporter in the world. So, and one thing Jefferson said, he goes, some of your animals over there, wow, they're so small that we could, they could walk underneath one of our moose, right? I mean, so they're trying to do this, and so it seems to me that Sierra, in contrast to people like Humboldt who are trying to counter the discourse about the inferiority of the New World, particularly this tropical and tropics discourse linked to population, Sierra embraces it, right? Because so this is sort of a new piece that it has a history, but he's sort of bringing into the discussion in saying that, so this seems to be one old discourse that's an element of his critique that doesn't come from Humboldt. It seems to me like the contemporary issues probably play a role here too. So one of them would be, the idea that, silver isn't what it used to be. And, it's silver's the natural resource wealth of a bygone era, especially with the declining value of silver. So, this is something particular to Sierra's age. It's something particular to what's going on in the world. And conversely, in this age of industrialization, it seems to me that fossil fuels are put in way higher regard. There were actually books in Mexico that rank countries by their consumption of fossil fuels. And so now that we've shifted, now all of a sudden this Mexico isn't blessed. It actually got the wrong natural resources. If we turn to the issue of colonization, it seems to me also, you read the writing on the wall. Mexico has been unsuccessful in bringing in foreign colonists. Even though there's been an official colonization policy, they brought us, a group over from Italy, et cetera. They were successful bringing people over to Texas, but that ended in a nightmare, right? So, and if you compare like with the United States or even Argentina or even Brazil, Mexico it just doesn't, those predictions by this time just don't seem to be It's not just a matter of it's just around the corner. It's like, let's look at the writing on the wall, look at the new world we live in. And so I think that the issue of contemporary conditions also shapes his analysis. And that's a little bit ironic because Mexico is about to kind of go into, for the first time in its history as an independent nation, sort of a period of sustained material progress. So that's what I'm working on. And I'm still trying to get my head around all this. And thanks for letting me share it with you. And if people have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear them.
Well, allegedly, going back to Jefferson, allegedly he thought that mastodons and mammoths were still a thing.
Okay. So in other words, we can't believe. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because.
It's apocryphal.
Yeah, but.
The idea that he thought that mastodons and mammoths were still around and still roaming the earth.
Yeah, I mean, his notes on Virginia was, actually a book that Humboldt read and others read as sort of this. It's interesting because they had a connection too, in the sense that when Humboldt came back from Mexico, he went to the United States, and Jefferson was very interested in all the information cartography about the resources in Mexico. And some people claim that, well, Humboldt was a spy, and that led to the Mexican-American War, and that's kind of a whole other narrative. Yeah.
Question. I have a feeling other people might be wondering this. I wonder what would it be like if somebody said some of the same things today about us? I mean, aren't there a certain number of parallels? We have this kind of inflated sense of national identity. We're supposed to be so wealthy. We're supposed to be so free, so powerful. Our standard of living is so high. And we spend so much time worrying about this and trying to make real our sense of our national identity. What would happen if somebody did come up and say, and maybe there are some of the candidates who are saying this, I don't know, I haven't been thinking that.
So what would happen if that, so is there a parallel here?
Right, could somebody come and say, hey, maybe we need to just tone down our national identity a little bit?
Well, I mean, wasn't that who the guy who wrote Poverty in America, like in the 70s or something? Yeah. And I mean, in the Mexican case, when actually in the post-1940s, you had the Mexican miracle, and they were sort of boasting, gee, we are doing pretty well now. And a U.S., probably people know about this, the anthropologist, right, Oscar Lewis from University of Illinois, he wrote a book about Mexican poverty, and they condemned him in Mexico. But so what would they? I mean, I know I've heard critiques. I mean, you hear critiques of the United States, and then people might say, why don't you get out of America, right? Just get out of, if you don't like it. So I mean.
It's just a thought experiment.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about the public discourse today, and it seems like, I mean, we do have two narratives today in the United States. I mean, if you look at the United States comparatively and from a global perspective, I'm not sort of talking about resource endowment or anything, but I'm just sort of talking about how it's doing, and the level of growth and the numbers, et cetera, and the levels of employment. I mean, China's kind of wavering a little bit. The European Union's got its problems, and Mexico. I mean, the United States looks pretty good, but then if you talk to you listen to the Republican candidates, I mean, everything is. So that's a thought-provoking thing. I'll have to keep thinking about it. Yes.
I would think another perhaps more apt parallel might be to the economies of Chile and Brazil, the current economies of Chile and Brazil.
You mean today or then?
Today.
Okay.
In that, I mean, von Humboldt was writing during a time when the Industrial Revolution had not yet occurred.
Right.
So the whole economic basis of the world economy had shifted by the time that Sierra was writing.
That's true.
And so fossil fuels were important for driving it, and Mexico's economy prior to that was based upon export of natural resources.
Right.
In the case of Chile, Brazil, and to a lesser degree Peru, it seems like their economies over the past 20 years have very much been kind of boom and bust based upon how Asia is doing, because they're based almost exclusively upon export of natural resources, wood, copper, and there are some really major critiques that are going on in both Chile and Brazil, I know, about what they're doing in terms of selling off their natural resources, and then they're basically buying back materials that are built using those natural resources at a higher price than what they exported them at. So in any case, it's part of the critique that is going on right now, I know, in the economies. And it sounds to me, it's a slightly different critique that Sierra's making, but basically he's bemoaning the fact that Mexico is kind of based upon, its economy is largely based upon natural resources that are difficult to extract and difficult to export, and the rest of the world economy is kind of leaving them behind.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that actually some other writers, you even see in that edited volume that Sierra edits. There's a chapter on industry, and that guy really, oh, if only we were, had what Great Britain had, and yeah, I think you're right.
The narrative he had was different from the previous one, where Mexico was rich. His narrative was accepted; it wasn't challenged.
Okay, that's a good question. My understanding is this: that, well, a couple things happened. One thing, when people started blaming Humboldt, I'll answer what you're saying, but when people started blaming Humboldt on this, saying, hey, he kind of fooled everybody, he was sold on Mexico, he was a dreamer. Some other people said, hey, wait a minute, look, read the whole book. He points out there's problems here too. But my understanding is this: it depends historically when. When Sierra wrote this, he didn't really write it for any controversial political end. It seemed to be more a reflection essay. Actually, what was going on in Mexico at that time in terms of economy and development and policies, colonization, promotion of the railroads, and promotion of industry. And I mean, Sierra, he was a little concerned about lack of democracy, but in the economic realm, he thought that Diaz was doing pretty well. So it wasn't really a controversial critique. And it seems to me, at that time, what we see is that it didn't get that much attention. But what happens is then other people, the científicos, who were part of the regime, who basically liked what the government was doing, picked up on it, and they almost used it as a way of saying, hey, our ancestors didn't know where it was at. We realize that, Mexico is poor, it needs capital, technology, hard work in order to move forward, and Diaz is doing that, and we're way better than the guys that came before us. When and it's sort of so, but at the same time as that's going on, you still have this Mexico Prospero. You still have the boosterism, the people trying to get the foreign investment in, and we're talking about, yeah, it's got all this great, there's discourses saying that Mexico's rich, naturally rich, but, owing to the native sort of ethic and values, no one really bothered to develop this stuff. So you have competing discourses at the same time, but there's not really a debate. When it becomes controversial is more during the Mexican Revolution. And some of the people who are promoting, because the revolution, as I said, it's based on this idea of the Porfirian regime was the old regime. We're overthrowing it. It was an inequitable regime. It was a regime about economic concentration and bowing down to foreigners. And at that point in time, we see some of Sierra's followers, Carlos Diaz Dufo and Bulnes, talk about the redistribution during the revolution, and they say, these guys are crazy. It's not going to amount to anything because Mexico's naturally poor. Our problem, the people aren't starving because of bad distribution. They're starving because the country just doesn't offer that much. And some of the revolutionaries answered them and they claimed the revolutionaries said, you guys are just like Humboldt or Iturbide, who said Mexico is the greatest place in the world and we can solve everything just by redistributing the pie. And some of those guys answered them and said, we've taken a hard look at this, and you're unfairly characterizing us. We realize it's more complicated than that. So there was some of that, and some people also did call like Francisco Bulnes the pessimist. Like, so this guy, right, well, nothing's good. We're doomed to poverty, and there's nothing we can do about it. And actually, even during the revolution itself, some of the revolutionaries took up the mantle, because one of the big things they do when they argue this point that Mexico's naturally poor is they always argue conventional wisdom is off, and I'm the truth teller, right? And that they talked to him about people who would sort of, one of the leading revolutionaries, Daniel Cosilla Villegas, in the 1920s and 30s, he follows Sierra and he says, everyone's so cheery about, Mexico and revolutionary Mexico. Well, I want to tell you something, we don't have much here. And so I guess that, and he kind of thought, it's sort of a pessimistic message in a way because it's, but only I think at moments when it was, the critique was utilized for political ends, did you see much of a pushback in a debate? Yes?
Was there ever any sentiment of this whole idea of, well, he's speaking to outsiders and saying, well, just leave us alone? I mean, I always wondered as you were talking about this whole perception of a national identity that says, we have all these, we're a poor country. I mean, is he saying it all to outsiders?
Okay, so is Justos here talking to foreigners?
Yeah.
To try and, so who's his audience?
Yeah.
Is that your question?
Yes.
I think it's mostly, I mean, he was a journalist. He wrote in the national press. I mean, he went to places like, he visited places like the United States, and he was certainly a cosmopolitan figure. But I think he was mostly speaking to a national audience. And I think that, I mean, one of the interesting things about these criticisms that come out, and it's worth noting that the part of the critique that the part of the book that came out later, Mexico and Social Evolution, that 3-volume set, the part that Sierra wrote was a political evolution. So a lot of these discussions actually come out in historical works or works that take a historical perspective on Mexican development. So I think that he's mostly talking to, having a conversation with his contemporaries, and also trying to maybe even a reflection on Mexican development from the perspective of a historian. He actually also wrote school text for school children about Mexico's history, et cetera, et cetera. So it's more of a national discussion.
Question about the United States. With the European Union and the troubles it's having with Greece and England wanting to, I mean Great Britain wanting to exceed,
Right.
and which has got Ireland concerned with their finances, and China's economic boom due to the building. Once it reaches its saturation,
Right. It's sort of,
once it reaches its saturation point, it's going to level and decline. Is the like the Trans-Pacific group compared to the European Union, to where when all the countries around the world get into a group, the preconception of how rich they are realized through the global economy.
So, well, we do have blocks, right?
Right.
The Trans-Pacific is one. The one that, obviously, speaking of the United States, you speak of Mexico. It's a North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada, and you're saying, and I think that's you make an interesting point, which is, and there's a whole debate, right, about the European Union, who can be part of it, because can you have countries with great levels of inequality create a union? Of course, the difference between their case and probably some of those issues do come out, right? As with some of the stumbling blocks with that, it seems to me like, I mean, if you take the difference between the North American Free Trade Agreement and the European Union, one would be that in the case of the NAFTA, you didn't have free movement of labor. So that's one way they dealt with that segmentation of wealth on, between the difference in levels of prosperity of the United States and Mexico. And the Trans-Pacific isn't, again, it isn't as integrated as something like the European Union, so that some of those fissures might not be as apparent. It's interesting because, I mean, some of the predictions about the consequences of NAFTA maybe were, in retrospect, some of them came true, but others didn't, and despite the disparities in wealth.